Ladies and gentlemen, this is a workshop on solving quadratic equations. So let's go ahead and review what we mean by solving quadratic equations. So when we're talking about solving a quadratic equation, we're talking about finding the zero of a function, right? This right here, the zero of a function. And a zero of a function is basically any value for which f of x is zero, meaning whenever you plug in any number, x, into your function, it will give you zero. That's what you're looking for. You're looking for the zero of the function. We're going to use the zero product property, which means that if I have any number, a, times any number b, if this gives me zero, then either a or b, one of those has to be equal to zero. So let's go ahead and try to use these properties to solve a quadratic equation. So this example number 1 is asking me, what are the solutions of the quadratic equation x squared minus 5x plus 6 is equal to 0? It's very important that whenever we solve a quadratic equation, we always equal it to 0. So this is going to be very important. Once it's equal to 0, just like it is here, we go ahead and try to factor this out, right? We're trying to solve this by factoring. So as we learned in our last lesson, to factor something out with an a of 1, meaning ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is equal to 1. All we do is we look for this c, and we look at this b, and we ask ourselves, okay, what numbers can I multiply to get to 6, but add up to get to negative 5? And so we look at the multiples of 6. We have 1 times 6, right? But since I'm going to add up to a negative number, well, then that means that both of these numbers have to be negative. So I'm going to go ahead and add these two together. This still gives me positive 6, right? Negative 1 times negative 6 will give me positive 6. But when I add them together, this gives me a negative 7. So this is not going to be it. What about negative 2 times negative 3? Well, if I multiply these, they give me positive 6. And when I add them up, this actually gives me negative 5, which is what I'm looking for. So these are going to be my two factors. Simply stated, this factors out into x minus 2 times x minus 3. And of course, this all has to equal to 0, right? Because of our zero product property, if either of these is 0, then the whole thing will be 0. So I'm actually looking for two answers here. I'm looking for x minus 2 is equal to 0 and x minus 3 is equal to 0. I simply solve for these by adding 2 to both sides. I get x is equal to 2. By adding 3 to both sides, I get x is equal to 3. So these are my two solutions. That's for solving by factoring. Now there are other ways to solve quadratic equations, specifically with table, which simply means that you go ahead and grab your graphing calculator and you solve for the equation by looking at where your table gives you a 0 in your y column. First steps first, you're going to have to go ahead and equal this to 0. How do I do that? By simply subtracting 2 and adding 2x to both sides. So minus 2 here, plus 2x, I get 5x squared, plus 32x, plus 12 is equal to 0. Once I have that, ladies and gentlemen, I can go ahead and plug it into my calculator. I'm going to go ahead and turn this on, go to New Document. I'm going to go ahead and add a graph, and I'm going to go ahead and just input my equation, 5x squared plus 32x plus 12 is equal to, I'm going to get that graph, right? Now, we're going to go ahead and show how to solve using a graph in a bit, but right now we're working on table. So we're going to go to View, we're going to go to Table, Split Screen Table, and we're going to look for somewhere where you might see a 0 in your y column. Look at that, we found it at x is equal to negative 6. Now, a 0 is right between the places where it changes from a negative number, like at negative 5, which is equal to negative 23, to a positive number, like negative 7 is equal to positive 33. So is there anywhere else where it changes from a positive number to a negative number? Oh yeah, right there, from -1 to 0, which is from -15 to +12. That means that it has to cross the x-axis, which is really what we're looking for a crossing of the x-axis. To go ahead and get smaller increments, we go to Menu, we go to Table, we go to Table Settings. We're going to go ahead and start the table at -1, and we're going to go ahead and change the table step, or change the increment to 0.1. We press OK, and we see that it increments by 0.1 each time, and at -0.4 we have our other zeros, so x is also equal to -0.4. Now lastly, we're going to go ahead and solve a quadratic equation by graphing. Now this one is really very simple. Our first step is going to go ahead to equal this to 0, so we're going to go ahead and subtract 15 from both sides. This will give us 2x squared plus 7x minus 15 is equal to 0. And we go back to our trusty calculator. I'm going to go ahead and start a new document. I'm going to go ahead and add a graph. And I'm going to plug in my equation 2x squared plus 7x minus 15. And when I plot that, it gives me these two equations. Now, I can clearly see that this is going to be -1, 2, 3, 4, 5, -5. But just to be sure, I'm going to go ahead and go to Menu, Analyze Graph. And I'm going to go to Find the Zero. It's going to ask me for the lower bound, basically meaning between here, between my lower bound and my upper bound, there should be a 0, a crossing of the x-axis. And we see that we find it at x is equal to -5. But we also see another 0 right over here. So let's go ahead and find that by doing the same thing. We analyze graph, we find the 0, the lower bound, and the upper bound, and we see that this 0 is x is equal to +1.5. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. 3 very simple ways to go ahead and find the real roots, the real zeros, the x-intercepts of a quadratic equation.